welcome to this edition of the Late Night Review. And tonight I want to talk about a movie that I grew up watching, a movie that's really important to me in the sense that I have a lot of nostalgia for it. It's not my generation, but it's a movie I have a lot of nostalgia for. I think it's very well done. And it's a movie, I like movies primarily from the 80s. That's my decade. That's more my generation. I'm 46. I really like the movies of the 80s, but in truth, every decade has great movies, including the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and of course 90s and all the way up to the present time. But the 80s those are the movies I like the most across pretty much all genres, but there's some great movies from the 70s, 60s, and 50s. And one of those older movies that I've always loved is The Vikings with Kirk Douglas, Janet Leigh, Tony Curtis, Ernest Borgnine, and it's a wonderful movie to me. I think it's well done. It has good action, great performances by all the actors and actresses. I think that it's one of my favorite movies of all time. It's definitely in my top 30 movies of all time. And it's one of my favorite Kirk Douglas movies. And I've always loved Kirk Douglas and Michael Douglas. Always loved their acting. I think they are two of the greatest actors of all time. And Kirk Douglas in The Vikings is probably my favorite movie with Kirk Douglas, except for probably The Champion. The Champion, The Detective Story, and maybe The Man Without a Star. Man Without a Star. And there's some others too and Tough Guys. I think Tough Guys with him and Burt Lancaster was really good. I think those are probably my favorite Kirk Douglas movies, but I know there's some I'm forgetting. There's one that's kind of unknown called The Master Touch that he did in Italy, which is a good movie too. But tonight I'm talking about The Vikings, and I think The Vikings is a fun movie. It has adventure, some funny parts too, but mostly it's a drama, action. And for an older movie, it doesn't drag on. It really doesn't. It's not a slow movie. I wouldn't regard it. I don't think anyone could fairly look at The Vikings and categorize that as a slow movie. I don't think so. I think there might be a couple scenes that might drag on a little too long, but most of the movie is pretty fast paced. There's good action in there, and the sword fighting is actually good. Some movies, like the Hercules movies, the older Hercules movies, I really enjoy them, but some of the fighting is really fake, even though I like those movies a lot. But not so in The Vikings. There's a lot of sword fighting in it, and the fighting's pretty realistic. The score, I like the score, I like the directing, I like the screenplay, I like the dialogue between the characters and the drama. It's a love story too, and Kirk Douglas, I think, basically, even though everyone does a good job, I look at it as a Kirk Douglas film. It's a Kirk Douglas movie primarily, even though Tony Curtis does great, Janet Leigh, Ernest Borgnine. Ernest Borgnine plays Ragnar, Kirk Douglas's father, and I think the interaction, the dialogue between the characters is fun and interesting, and it's got a good supporting cast as well. It's one of those movies, if you haven't seen it, you should watch it. It's one of the best sword and sandal movies, but it's pretty realistic in certain areas, which I like. It's got adventure, but it doesn't have the fantasy genre aspect. It doesn't have the sorcery aspect that you get in a lot of sword and sandal movies. It's pretty reality based. The director never had the Vikings with horned helmets because in real life, most archaeologists and scholars, they think that the Vikings didn't have horned helmets, and if they did, it might have been for ceremonial purposes. But yeah, it's a great movie. I really like The Vikings. It's a movie that not only did I grow up watching, but I think with the Vikings and then also the Conan movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger and other movies similar to these in the genre, there's such a sense of freedom. Like when I watch these, it takes you back in time to a time where there's so much more land, there's so much more room, beautiful trees and mountains. We still have those, but meaning is there's a sense of freedom I get from these movies. You know, you're out there with your friends and you got your equipment, your weapons, and you're making your next plan, what you're going to do next, and you're camping. And just something about these movies, I feel a sense of freedom, and perhaps you feel that too. Not that I'm going to become a Viking or anything, but it's fun. One of my grandfathers was from Norway, so. But yeah, this movie is one of my favorites. If you haven't seen it, check it out. I don't think you'll be disappointed if you like this genre. If it's not your thing, you may or may not like it. But the interaction between the characters, especially the complex interaction between Kirk Douglas and Janet Leigh in here, is good. It's interesting, and it's sad. There's certain parts that are sad in here, and it's also a love story primarily between Janet Leigh and Tony Curtis. But I think Kirk Douglas steals the show. But I don't know if it was all. Maybe it's always been his show. Maybe it's always been a Kirk Douglas movie. That's the way I look at it. Maybe he was meant to steal the show, but does a great job. I think it is my favorite Kirk Douglas movie. If you haven't seen it, check it out. I like it. This has been the Late Night Review. I hope you enjoyed it. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Have a good night.